We're going to do this class a little bit like the first class, and that I have archival photos to show to you. And I feel that it's important for us to be able to look at the faces. Like, remember Reverend Hinton's strong eyes, fierce eyes last week, so that we know a little more about the people we're talking about. I know as a writer, it really helped me to be interviewing people face to face and meet them that way, or to talk to their family and hear about them that way. Or if in some rare cases that wasn't possible, the pictures could become really important, because I do think that a photographic or artistic record of us does tell the world some things about us. So I'm gonna remind you that with Stories of Struggle, I thought of it as there are two primary goals. There are many goals, but the primary ones are for you to know what really happened in South Carolina, and that's through the Black activists and the stories of their courage and perseverance. And it's also through the what some journalists sometimes call the TikTok, this, then this, then this, then this, then this, of the white supremacist leaders, because it contradicts the story of South Carolina as a moderate place during the civil rights movement. It was not. And it also allows us to see how many obstacles the Black activists encountered over their activism periods. So then we were going to talk, of course, about what it means to know the real stories of people, and how that might change our view of what happened before and what's happening now, and whether there is some redemptive quality to knowing more about people and their struggles. So with that, I'm going to go to share screen and disappear. Give the pictures priority. So I'm going to zip through. I'll just fly through the ones that you saw last week, reminding you who they are. So this is the wonderful plumber from Chirac, Levi Bird, Reverend Hinton, the NAACP president, Majeska Simpkins, this corresponding secretary, John McCrae, the brave newspaperman. This was the wounding and blinding of Isaac Woodard, and this is a fundraiser for Isaac Woodard. President Truman, who got energized by the Isaac Woodard's maiming. George Elmore, who sued for the right to vote and the end of the all-white primary. And a letter from Reverend Hinton about that. Willie Earl, who was lynched in Greenville by a mob of taxi drivers who were not convicted of his crime, even though they confessed. After the success of 2 lawsuits for the right to vote, this is Reverend Hinton voting. Reverend Archie Ware, who was, there was an attempted murder of him after he voted. And this is the voting in Columbia in 1948. After these lawsuits were won, more than 35,000 people registered to vote who were Black and had been blocked in South Carolina. Before that, there were about 5,000 who had managed to register to vote. So you can see that when people were not blocked from registering to vote, they did vote. So we're talking today and next week about Briggs versus Elliott, the petitioners and their struggles, and then the lawsuit itself next week. So this is Spring Hill Elementary School. It was built in the 1930s, and it was in operation until South Carolina, bustling to reframe separate but equal, started building schools for Black children to thwart the lawsuits asking for at least equal in the 50s. So this school was used from 1930 to 1950. It was an auxiliary building to Spring Hill Church, which was out in the rural area of Clarendon County. The first woman, if you're looking left to right, is Maddie Delane. Her husband was very prominent in Briggs versus Elliott. And next to her is Helen Richburg, whose husband also was very prominent in the Briggs versus Elliott struggle. And that is all the school children. And if you look at this building, you can see that a good wind could blow it over. So the way white taxpayers rationalized this was that they had most of the money because they had the jobs, and they had the land, and they had the stores. And so they felt that the money should go to white schools and not Black schools, even though Black people were, of course, taxpayers. but because of their impoverished situation, perhaps their tax percentage was not what it was for the whites. So the whites said, we take it all, we make it all, we take it all. And so many of the churches were Masonic lodges or auxiliary buildings. Many of the schools, excuse me, were Masonic lodges that were used for schools and the lodge, or auxiliary buildings to a church or a donated cabin. The children's heat was oil drums that they brought coal for. Their water was water they would bring from wells. There was no school lunch. They brought their own food. They were usually sitting on discarded church pews. They did not have blackboards. Their school books were discarded books from the white schools with pages torn out or scribbles in them. It was really a horrific situation. And these were the primary schools. There were only something like 24 high schools at this point in time for Black students in the whole state. So often if you and your parents had the wherewithal, you would go to a boarding school. You would board or you would board with a family who lived near a high school. And that's how you got into higher education. This is in Blacksville. It's Macedonia High School. It's one of the few high schools. And Reverend Delane's son was born here. This is Harry and Eliza Briggs. So the petition for Briggs versus Elliott, Harry Briggs was the first to sign, and traditionally petitions and then lawsuits are named after the first petitioners, and it's often alphabetical. What's really important about this picture is that he is a veteran. And I think I might have mentioned before how important veterans are to this story. They had gone to World War II to fight for democracy, and they came back and could not get the first class citizenship that democracy promises. So many veterans were asking for GI Bill benefits, and they had to fight for that in Somerton. They were denied, and it's one of the ways that Reverend Delane first stepped forward, going to the state Department of Education to say that there were Black veterans and they had a right to their GI Bill education. And so Reverend Seals, who also became involved in the Briggs versus Elliott petitioning, became one of the GI Bill teachers. So Harry Briggs worked as a gas station attendant. His wife there, Eliza, was a housekeeper in the motels in Somerton. Somerton was on the route then to Florida. It was a tourist route, and so there were several motels that employed people in a variety of ways. And her family were the Gambles, and they were landowners. And so perhaps because of that and her upbringing as someone whose family owned land, they had carriages they went to church in rather than just a wagon. The Briggs family did not work for white people in the fields. Lots of people supplemented their income by picking peas or cotton or corn during the crop times, and their children would too. They didn't do that. And like many people in Somerton, because of white abuse, they did not allow their children to work in the homes of white people. So how they became the petitioners, the first and therefore the namesake for the petition, is that their house was near Reverend Seals' church. And so the NAACP, when they sent the petition to be signed, they were warned in a letter accompanying the petition that it was probably public knowledge and they would be in danger if they were at one of the churches, that they might be all assaulted together. And therefore they needed to pick a home and go to the home to sign. And so the Briggs's home was just 2 or 3 blocks away. And so people walked to the Briggs's home, which is very tiny. Imagine, I'm very bad on measurements. Well, it was a small, very small living room. Imagine a quarter of a room that you might have today. I've been in the house, which still exists. And behind that, a dining room, kitchen, and then 2 or 3 bedrooms is brick. And it was right next door to the Delane's house. This is the remnants of the Delane's house. So in 1950, after the petition had been signed, but before they'd made it to court, Reverend Delane had been transferred, and this is Reverend Delane here, by his bishop to Lake City in Florence County, because his prominence as a promoter of the NAACP and the separate but equal at this point in time petitions, had made him a target of the KKK. So he kept his house. He was a landowner. He had over time bought several properties in the town, and he had transferred most of them into other people's hands to protect himself from losing his properties. But the house was burned down one night. The fire department responded and then refused to put out the fire. They claimed that it was a couple hundred feet from the city limits, which it was, but their hoses could have reached. And there was a complaint made to the FBI, who said, well, they said their hoses didn't reach, their hoses didn't reach. So the house burned down to the foundation, as you can see here. This is 1951, and this is many of the petitioners. And I'm going to try with my cursor here to point out some of the people that we're going to talk about. So this is Mary Oliver. She and her husband owned Oliver's Cafe. Their children all got a college education, and the Oliver generation, Louis Oliver was the father. He had gotten college too. His parents were ahead of the time, so to speak, and pushed their children out of the state and into education. Besides the cafe, he had land he owned and farmed, and he also had jukeboxes. And after the petition efforts started, he would have to drive at night with his headlights off, armed because he was afraid of being abducted by the KKK, to service the jukeboxes and to supply his cafe. He had other people buy things in their name, and then he would pay them back. And at their cafe, they also tutored people in voter registration. And he died of a cerebral hemorrhage during all this. And Mary Oliver signed the second petition for desegregation after so much of I call it terrorism, that was going on around their family and other families. And when she was asked why, she said, I promised my husband I would be a woman. I would be a woman, not strong woman, just be a woman. Next to her is Sarah Reagan. Sarah Reagan's family, and you can see this with Mary Oliver too, had white ancestors. They were a green-eyed bunch of folks, and her husband was known for, they were near I'm blanking on the name, a large forest and swamp in Clarendon County. It's going to come to me in a minute. Help me out, guys. You can help me out later. So he was a guide for very rich white Northerners who would come down to hunt, and his children would go out with him. And because he was known as an expert marksman, the family felt they had no need to be afraid. He also was a house painter, and once the petitions began, all his house painting dried up because most of his clients were white. This is Celestine Parson, and the Parsons were, Benny Parson was active many years into the petition. He would bring clothes and food donations down from the north. Next to her is Catherine Briggs. This is Harry Briggs, and here's Eliza Briggs. So there's part of the family. And if we go back here, and I'm sorry if our faces are in the way, but you're going to see, let me start here. This is Reverend Richburg, and his church, Liberty Hill AME, was very important in encouraging the petitioners. And he stayed throughout into the 60s when he died young. There were rumors that he had been poisoned for his activism. This is Reverend Delane, who you just saw his house that had been burned. He did not sign the petition where Reverend Richburg did. His daughter says they were advised not to. And he, as I said, was moved out of town in 50, and he was run out of the state a year later. And so he was very important in the beginning, but then was not physically present later. This is one of the Briggs children, Harry Briggs Jr. This is Reverend Washington Seals. His church, St. Mark AME, was in town, and it was a regular meeting place for the petitioners. His home was burned to the ground. He had a hog farm in the country where he owned a little land. It was destroyed. And he had so many times when the KKK was surrounding his house that his wife moved to New York to help support the family and to stay safe. And they were raising a grandson that went with her. And this is Levi Pearson. So Levi, and then next to him are Hammett, and next to Hammett is Jesse. The Pearsons were how this all started. So in 1946, the Pearsons had been for several years providing transportation to children in Davis Station, which was 9 miles outside of Somerton. And so if you went to a graded class, you had to go into Somerton to Scotts Branch. And there were a couple of rural schools that you couldn't get to once Congaree Swamp, once the dam was built, and because there was flooding and there were lakes that you would have to cross. So there was difficulty getting to some of these smaller schools. So these children were walking 9 miles. And by the way, I walked it with some Scotts Branch children at one of the anniversaries. 9 miles is a long way to walk to school, especially back then when you've got dirt roads and roaming dogs that would threaten you. So the Pearsons had a truck that they put boards across and would take the children on that. And then they gathered with more than a dozen other families and bought a bus that they just couldn't keep running. And then they bought a second bus, which they called the Sunshine Bus, because it only seemed to run in the sunshine. It seemed to break down in the rain when they needed it the most. And out of that, they petitioned for a school bus. And how that came about was through Reverend Hinton. He had gone to a meeting in which Oliver Hill in another state, an attorney, had simply walked children, Black children, to a bus stop and said, get on the bus. They got on the bus and the school district backed down. But what happened in Clarendon County was when they went to ask for a bus, the superintendent, the county superintendent and the district superintendent, both using obscenities, said, we're not buying any gas, we're not buying any buses, we're not doing anything to help your children go to school. And so they decided that they would petition for a school bus after Reverend Hinton came back from this NAACP meeting hearing about Hill, and in his Baptist preacher shouting mode said that he wanted a minister or a teacher who had the bravery to petition for a school bus. And where were you? And Reverend Delane was attending summer school at Allen, and one of his professors put him on the spot too. And so he came back home and knowing what the Pearsons were doing, talked to the Pearsons, and they petitioned. Now, what happened was the school board just completely ignored the petition. It was, a good example of how Black people were treated as voiceless. So this went on for months and months and months, where they're trying to get a hearing. They set up a hearing one time and don't notify any of the Black people that it's going to be held. And then they're like, oh, well, they haven't come. We must not be important. And they get Harold Boulware. I should have put a picture of him. I'm sorry I didn't. He is the local NAACP council. And when you come into a state from somewhere else, you have to have a local council. And that's what Harold Boulware was. So he was doing his own lawsuits, but he was also representing the NAACP. He writes to say that there will be a petition and it will be filed in court. They finally get a hearing, but they don't get a school bus. What happens is several of the officials come to the Pearson farm, and there were dozens and dozens in just a county of school districts. One school could be a school district. And so Hammett and Levi Pearson have farmland that adjoins each other, and their houses in one school district, their land is in another school district. Because there's so few high schools, the child that they filed in the name of, James Pearson, is going to another school district and trying to sort this out. It sounds to me like shady shenanigans, but what Marshall did was he said, this is going to defeat the lawsuit. We're going to pull out. Well, by now, these people that you see here are pretty darn energized, and they're not going to let this go. So they keep meeting, they keep talking, and they decide that they're going to pursue something that Marshall is interested in, Thurgood Marshall and the National NAACP, which is demanding equal. So from Plessy versus Ferguson, which we talked briefly about last week, we know that the South had established what they called separate but equal. So if you were in a train, you were in the first car because that was the car that got the cinders and that would set your clothes on fire. And that was the car that would be destroyed if you were hit, or you were in the baggage car where you were standing with the chickens and the luggage. So that was separate and certainly not equal. And it was the same situation with the schools, as you saw. And so it was so horrendously unequal in Clarendon County that Thurgood Marshall thought this would be a decent place for a lawsuit. And he also thought it would be a very dangerous place for a lawsuit because people were so deeply poor and so deeply under the thumb of white supremacists. But a lawsuit comes about, as you know. And this photo was taken by Cecil Williams, who at 11 and 12 years old was the apprentice to E.C. Jones, who was one of the main Black photographers in South Carolina. And he would carry around the Graflex camera slide. So you've seen pictures of this, the enormous photographic equipment. There's a camera that has to be set up on a tripod, and there are glass slides that are pulled out of a case and put into the camera. And so mostly what Cecil is doing is he's toting around the equipment, but he's also taking photographs. And this is his photograph. He's a child when he takes it. He's been pulled out of school. He's gone down to see Thurgood Marshall get off the Silver Meteor. All the trains had names in Charleston. I think this is a picture that also says not only something about Thurgood Marshall's strength, he's almost like a towering statue there, isn't he? But also this is a man that's on the road. Look how battered his suitcase is. And he's in the style of the time. People wore these raincoats that sometimes had linings, you know, for the winter. And of course he's got a hat on. And it was very much the style then, the mustaches. Almost all the elderly Black men I interviewed had a very dashing mustache. So after the petition, and the possibility that they were going to go to court before Jay Wade's Waring, who we talked about last time, who had provided the end of the white primary and equal pay for teachers, there were some early celebrations, and this is in 1951. Here's Reverend Richburg again, the minister for Liberty Hill AME. You saw his wife in front of the school. This is Majeska Simpkins that you saw last week, corresponding secretary. Here's Reverend Seals, who I told you is church and home and hog farm were threatened. This is S.J. McDonald, who was an NAACP officer in the county. This is Reverend Delane. And here's Harry Briggs and John McCrae. And this is Flutie Boyd, who you see in a lot of pictures. He was a school teacher in Manning and very supportive of the petitions. And next to him are Reverend Hinton and Eugene A.R. Montgomery. And Eugene Montgomery was the first employed or paid field secretary for the NAACP. And he's the one that's traveling the roads and going to the churches and trying to sign up petitioners. And what some people miss mentioning when they talk about Briggs is there are many, many petitions. There were petitions signed in all the churches. There were hundreds of people who were willing to sign. The petition that you see that has 107 petitioners for separate but equal, and then 46, I think, for the desegregation, that's a winnowing down of the petitioners and a decision on what area they're going to be representing. But there were hundreds of people who were saying, yes, it's time for our children to have equal education. And so this is just a small representation of the people that were involved. But these are the people that are remembered because there are records for them. Majeska Simpkins, again, you know, corresponding secretary, and Reverend Delane, his papers at South Caroliniana. He was one of those people who was writing letters to the editor and writing letters to the NAACP and writing letters to the FBI, which takes a lot of courage at that point in time because, as you see, he suffers the consequences of being so bold and out there. John McCrae, he runs a newspaper until 54, and when the newspaper folds for a variety of reasons, he is traveling the state, reporting on Briggs versus Elliott and other events from 54 on for Black-owned newspapers that are coming in by mail. They would be put in secret wrappings, and the porters, who were most often Black on trains, would sort of smuggle them into towns. And so these are the people who leave records, and we know more about, and it's why I think oral histories are important. And my book's important because it collects more than the people that are obviously part of the story from their paper record. I wanted you to see some children. We're going to be talking about the children. These are the children who are walking 9 miles to school. This is Beatrice Brown. Her father was Henry Brown. He was a caretaker at the schools, and he was somewhat friendly with the principal and the superintendent. And so he wasn't fired in the first round. He wasn't fired to the second round. This is B.B. Delane. He's the younger son of Reverend Delane. He became an educator and brought all his students from Charlotte, where he was an educator, onto a civil rights tour about 15 years before he died. I went on it with him. And one of my favorite moments in that tour was there was a couple of children, Charlotte's big city, that were from other countries. There was a child whose heritage was from India. And he became thrilled when a civil rights attorney sang the bus off. So the civil rights attorney, J. Charles Jones, who was important in the Charlotte sit-ins, came and sang civil rights songs before the students went on this tour all the way down into Alabama. And when we got to the Birmingham Museum and saw the burned bus, we also saw some other exhibits, and among them was an exhibit about sit-ins with J. Charles Jones's name. And this child was reading this, and he said, "Wow, I saw him, this is history." I thought that was just so wonderful because it made such an impact on him. And B.B. Delane made that possible. He was carrying on, in his father's footsteps to make sure that people knew the story. And remind me to say something about the Delane family after the slideshow. This is Reverdy Wells. Reverdy Wells' life was essentially derailed. He was part of a group of students who, during this activism, before the petition and before the court case, were also concerned about how the Black schools would sometimes be run by people that were truly at the behest of the whites. And so they had a superintendent who was taking the money they had to pay for school books, taking the money for school books and for other school events, and using it for his own personal means. And he was also altering the transcripts of students, and he altered Reverdy Wells' transcript. And Reverdy Wells was a very bright student on his way intentionally to college, and that was destroyed by Isaiah Benson, the principal, who altered his transcript so that it looked like he was not a good student. The families, energized by their petition work, did manage to get through a hearing. Again, it was a very long process. Isaiah Benson fired, and then the white power structure got Benson to sue Delane as the leader of the parents committee. Luckily, Delane, as I mentioned before, had put his property in other people's names, so they couldn't take over his property. But of course, he was being sued for slander. He was found guilty, even though all that they said was apparently true about Isaiah Benson. And when the house burned, a couple years later, they took the insurance from the house, all of it, although the judgment was for $4,000 something, and the house insurance was $17,000. They took all of it in the Benson lawsuit. This is a home of Hinton's. He's like Thurgood Marshall, traveling in and out of Clarendon. This is home in Columbia, the KKK, probably, no one was identified, shot into the house. He was not home. His wife was upstairs. As you can see, the bullets went through the walls and destroyed they were embedded in the walls, a staircase, broke some things like a mirror and a plant case. This is, we've now moved to 1957, I think, and this is 1956. This is the White Citizens Council, and we're going to be talking throughout the rest of the class about the White Citizens Council. And it was the KKK in business ties. Here's the Confederate flag. It's rather intimidating. This is all white men who believe in white supremacy. They're there for the first statewide meeting of the WCC, which was founded after Brown v. Board in 54, 55 in Mississippi, and quickly grew in South Carolina, likely because S. Emory Rogers, the attorney for the state of South Carolina, was so busy traveling the state promoting economic terrorism, I guess is what you could call it. So what the White Citizens Council members would do is they were the magistrates, they were the lawyers, they were the bankers, they were the mayors. During the sit-in, the person who was hearing all the sit-in cases was a member of the WCC and the membership recruiter, for example. And so what they're doing is they're getting any petitions that are filed, they're going through the names. If it's their employee, they claim that person and they fire them and they keep harassing them. So I do mean terrorism when I say economic terrorism. They're doing everything possible. When the Pearsons asked for a bus, they were not sold seed, they were not sold feed, they were not sold fertilizer. Most people rented the farm machinery. They couldn't rent the farm machinery. They had timber, they couldn't sell it. They had to do like Oliver did and get someone else to claim it as theirs and sell it. And they would, get less money because they're giving money to the people that are helping them out. So South Carolina quickly had 40,000 members. This is a small state. Somerton, for example, is only 957 people. But everybody who was a businessman is essentially interested in keeping control completely. And I wanted to see you this picture. These are the speakers. So this is Senator Eastland from Mississippi, but you may recognize this person. It's Senator Strom Thurmond. And as you probably know, Strom Thurmond was serving first as a governor in 1947 to 1951. So during some of this time period of the Briggs versus Elliott petition. And then he was the Dixiecrat president in 1948, which was all about white supremacy. He said white people will continue to rule this country. And then he served in the Senate from 1954 to 2003. This is L. Mendel Rivers. He was a senator from Charleston. And this is Solomon Blott. He was the Speaker of the House in South Carolina from, let me see, what are the dates here? 37 to 47, and then 51 to 1973. So think about this, that during a time that many of us may remember, these are the people who are in charge of the state, and they have made quite clear their white supremacist stands. Later, they mollify what they're saying in public because they need the Black vote, because more and more Black people are now able to register to vote. But I'd be interested to hear what you think about whether people really truly change. This is the KKK. This is 1957. And if you were Black, you couldn't set foot on the State House grounds, and you couldn't set foot on USC grounds without the potential of being arrested. And here they are doing a march down Main Street. And they also are going to form a human cross on the State House grounds. And this is right after there has been a bombing of Claudia Sanders' home in Gaffney. She had joined with mostly ministers, white ministers, in writing for a booklet about moderation. And she had proposed a moderate way of desegregating the schools, and the KKK, we know it was the KKK this time because a couple of people were arrested, but of course, it's South Carolina, not convicted, had tried to dynamite her home 3 times before they blew anything up. No one was injured, but the house was damaged. This is them on the State House steps next to George Washington. And here is the women's auxiliary. So children and women belong to the KKK. There would be giant rallies out in rural areas. And I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but it would be sort of like a church or fairground gathering where there are sermons, so to speak, there's speeches. By sermons, I mean God would be invoked. There would be hymns, there would be songs, there would be passing the plate, and of course, there would be the cross burned. And so it's a good reminder of how entrenched these attitudes were, that a group like this, the Southern Poverty Law Center, clearly calls a terrorist group and has for decades, is hanging out at the State House grounds. So there we go. I'm going to return to you now. And I see there's a comment in chat. Daisy Delane Block, honorary member of the Lourie Center community and board of directors. So the families, the Delane family, I was going to ask you to remind me, but I'm actually remembering. The Delane family had some power in the community because Reverend Delane was, he was educated, he was a property owner, he was very articulate. He seemed to be one of those people like Reverend Hinton that was not afraid of saying anything. His children were mostly grown during much of this. And so they weren't entirely present during most of this activism because if, like B.B. Delane, they were young enough that, the family was run out of the state. But they were highly articulate, and their father had kept his letters, and he wrote for an AME magazine and several narratives of what happened. And so one of the ways that we know what happened is through Reverend Delane, but the other side of that is that Reverend Delane, I think, dominates the narrative for a lot of historians in a way that is somewhat unfair. The Pearsons, who really are the catalyst, are pretty much left out. The Briggses are often interviewed just briefly about the petition, but otherwise left out of a full story. Nathaniel, their youngest child, is still alive and has made a point of trying to tell the family story. But one of the things that always concerns me about how history is collected, if you are not someone who has the podium or the magazine cover or the documents that your family donates, then you may not be included in the story, even though you may have been a very important part of it, or you may dominate the story in a way that's not quite accurate. And so I think in some ways this is where journalism should come in. And of course, at that time and period, it did not in an effective way because the white-owned newspapers were busy censoring the Black story and following the propaganda of white supremacists. And the Black newspaper coverage was seldom because of the fact that the newspapers were having to cover from afar. So what I'm hoping we could talk about here is your interest in the petitioners and the supporters and the ministers. And then on the other hand, this incredible pressure that these people are undergoing and withstanding in a variety of ways from lynchings, the White Citizens Council, which, as I said, began in 54, 55, and also from the KKK, which was not a secretive organization. You see the hoods and you think, well, they're hiding their identities. They didn't really. Everybody knew who was in the KKK. It was not a secret. So I am going to challenge you. You have one more piece of homework toward the end, which is to look up somebody that has stayed with you from your reading and our discussion. So I'm hoping that some of you would unmute yourselves now and tell me who has stayed with you either from these pictures or if you were reading the book from your readings or your previous knowledge, someone that stays with you in terms of their petitioning side or their white supremacy, suppressed democracy side. And I'm going to go to gallery view. So I'm warning you because that means I could actually call on somebody. So who has something to say?
Claudia, can you hear me? Yeah. Well, one thing I was thinking of as I was looking at all the photos, the KKK terror wasn't only in South Carolina, obviously, or Texas or in the South. My grandfather, who was a newspaper man, publisher, and editor in Michigan, which is where I grew up, in the early 1930s, he wrote a lot about this group in Michigan called the Black Legion, and it was a KKK arm. And I don't know that they did any lynchings, but they had a lot of cross burnings and stuff. And so he did a lot of writing on it, put the names of the people in this group on the front page. And it turned out they were doctors and lawyers and businessmen and the sheriff and all of that. And so the Black Legion didn't like this at all. And so they ended up putting 2 contracts out on his life. Neither of them were successful. And he lived into his 70s. But anyway, it was a real issue in Michigan, at least in the 1930s, and I'm sure in many other states too.
And in Michigan now.
And in Michigan now, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I mentioned last time, why would we be surprised that the Confederate flag was being flown through the Capitol during the invasion of the Capitol? Mm-hmm. The 30s and the 40s and the 50s, the people who were running the country were people who believed that white people were superior and that they had an absolute right in their superiority to be in charge. Now, keep in mind their particular things that they're doing that enhance their appearance of superiority, like denying the vote and denying education. If you are denied an education, it's very likely that your life is going to be difficult. That's still true, right? And so they're also, and that great tradition of blaming the victim, claiming that Black people are childlike or have bad habits in other ways, and that is the reason that they need to be in charge. And this is, of course, on false ground, and it's self-serving. It's deeply untrue. And I'd like to add here that so many of the people that I interviewed were self-educated because of the way South Carolina had set things up, and brilliant. One of the people that I interviewed for the sit-ins, Dr. Thomas Gaither, is a mycologist that worked, he had a doctorate and worked in Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. He grew up in Great Falls, which is a textile town, and the textile industry did not hire Black people. For example, many of the industries, it didn't matter how educated you were or how talented you were. They weren't going to buy you because it was hire you because it was completely segregated. He says he has some remnants of bitterness, and that it's about his education. His mother was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. Their only book was a dictionary that she provided. His father was fired for having contact with unions and then for being in the NAACP from the jobs that he had, taught himself brick masonry and then supported the family that way. And Dr. Gaither became a leader in the Congress of Racial Equality. He's a follower still of nonviolent direct action. But all that was created from his own self, not from anybody helping him besides his own community. I'm not dismissing the strength of the Black community here. I'm just saying that the larger society was pretty much determined that he wouldn't succeed. And so I think one of the things that we can take from looking at the petitioners is a reminder of the incredible creativity and courage that people did muster to not only challenge this, but to white supremacy, but to shape lives that could benefit themselves and others against, all sorts of roadblocks. So thinking about, Jan's father and grandfather, excuse me, he probably had some support in the white community as a newspaper editor, and he had income. He had ways to protect himself. Not to say this wasn't terrifying Jan to have death threats, but to protect himself in a way that the people of Clarendon County did not. So, Carolyn, you're looking serious there. You got something to add?
I
gotta unmute yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry, Myra Nelson.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Carolyn was muted.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
I'm new to the state, so I didn't grow up with all this, but I must have I grew up in Michigan and California and Hawaii. The first time I met a friend of my dad's who worked for the National Council of Churches, a Black lady in Boston. She was tall, elegant, and I was immensely impressed with her. She was well educated, well spoken, very active. And it was the first time I had ever met a Black person that stunning. And so that kind of twisted my viewpoint a lot. So what I'm saying is I must have grown up with some sort of seeping out from the neighborhood, an attitude of, yeah, there's something different about those folks, which when I was living in Hawaii was totally knocked off the pins. It changed my viewpoint entirely, but also meeting this particular lady. So you really just have to keep in present time and look and see what's true.
Yeah, it's in the air, isn't it? It's
Yeah, it
in the
is.
very
It really
blood
is.
and sinew of the United States of
Yeah.
America. People say it's not patriotic to say that, but we have so many instances. And so I think it's why the conversation right now on anti-racism is so incredibly important. The discussion about white privilege, of looking at
Yeah.
opportunities that you have the minute someone looks at the color of your skin, or as you were saying, the assumptions that people have been making around you that without you noticing have become part of how you walk through life. I had my wake-up call at Oberlin College. My dad was an ROTC instructor, and I was 5 years old, and Oberlin was the end of the Underground Railroad. You could go across the river from Kentucky, and there you were in Ohio, and a free state. And it was also the first college, white-owned college, to accept Black men, and then pretty quickly women, white and Black. And so it was a wonderful place. And I had a father who had lived many places, had his own particular view of racial hierarchy, which was Asians, white people, and then Black people and Hispanics, and a mother who fancied herself a Southern belle and was just flat out racist. And all I saw around me contradicted them. I was so fortunate. The whole world around me said that everything they said was not true. And so at 5 years old, my parents were no longer on the pedestal. They were just crashed, they were crashed down on the ground, not trustworthy. And it was a blessing. It was a blessing to me, that I saw how people could say things that in my daily life I saw were not true. And so it put me on guard. The other thing was that I went to high school in Hawaii, Carolyn. So my high school, for example, it was military owned, and that was the other thing that was fortunate for me, was the military had been desegregated in '49. I'm not saying it was integrated, but it was certainly desegregated.
Yeah.
I had gone to desegregated schools almost every year of my life. And when I went to Hawaii, for example, there were Samoans, Hawaiians, Chinese, and a smattering of white and Black people. And so it was what they proudly called then the melting pot. You remember that?
Yeah, for sure.
Melting pot. And so it was a great example of a place. The Dalai Lama calls it a garden, a beautiful garden. There are roses, there are daisies, there, you name it, lilies of the valley. And so you're in that beautiful garden, and every flower is beautiful. And that is a fortunate way to bring up children and to create a nation that's fair, when there is that diversity at all times, which we still haven't achieved.
Yeah.
Myra, was it you that you were going to say something?
Yes, you were talking about being impressed, and as Stephanie typed in, at one time, Daisy Delane Block gave a talk at I think it was then the Capitol Senior Center, about her family and her background. And the Reverend Delane was her uncle.
Uh-huh.
And she tells a story about these children walking to school, and the school buses would deliberately, when it was raining, splash the kids. And she described at one point how the Reverend Delane stopped one of the buses and got on it and told the driver if he ever did that again, he would shoot him. Talking about courage. And every time you say something, I am so struck by the bravery of these people who
Yeah.
signed their name to petitions, who belong to the NAACP in the South. As you can tell, I'm a Yankee and I grew up in New York City. So this was not that much of a problem. And I was not aware, except for certain moments, of the cruelty that was taking place down south. I knew there was discrimination. And obviously, even New York did not escape that. But I just couldn't believe in reading your book
Yeah.
and reading Richard Gergel also wrote a book about the blinding. And it just is so horrifying. And I can't imagine the cruelty of people. And yet it still goes on, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's almost a casual cruelty. It's like or unthinking. Many people mention stories like Miss Delane did, that of walking and the white children would throw things out of the school bus at them. So there you are, you're a little kid, and it's just part of the culture that you're going to hurt other little kids, you know. And as I said, it's like it's almost in the air that people are unthinking in their cruelty. And I think that's why the Somerton story is so important, because it is a strong illustration of how powerful that was, but that also it could, at some cost and over a great period of time, we'll talk about that next time, be defeated. So Sandy Harris, you were a social worker. Where were you a social worker? In South Carolina?
In Connecticut, and then we relocated to South Carolina. So here in South Carolina, ended up at the Department of Defense afterwards, after a time in Orangeburg at the mental health center there in the substance abuse department. Yeah.
Oh, so Orangeburg is like the mother lode of the.
And that's where we live.
Uh-huh.
We're in Orangeburg. We're in Orangeburg. So that's what I was going to mention too. And I don't know, when you were talking about the Briggs versus education, and I thought I had it. I pulled it out the paper. There was a one-page advertisement actually that you mentioned Cecil Williams, and so Cecil had put in the paper. He was requesting that the Briggs name be placed on that Brown in education. He had petitioned that with the Supreme Court, and he had a copy of his letter. And I know he started a museum. I have not had an opportunity to visit the museum at all, but he's starting a museum in Orangeburg.
Yeah, you can arrange a virtual visit. If you just look for Cecil Williams, you can find.
Yeah, I know Cecil personally. I just haven't had an opportunity to. So his sister and my husband are really good friends, work together. But anyway, I just haven't had an opportunity to. But I knew that they were doing that, and I thought that was interesting. But there's been a lot of, I know for myself, I grew up in Baltimore. So I know Baltimore's on the Mason-Dixon line. It's the first Southern state. People say, well, you're from the South. But when we relocated, we had been in Connecticut for almost 20 years, and we moved here with my husband's work. And I noticed immediately the difference. And that's why I had taken this course. And then there was another one that the Lourie Center offered maybe about 2 years ago on civil rights in South Carolina. And I felt like I had stepped back 25, 30 years. I thought I had stepped back in history to the 70s. I felt like I was back in the 70s. And now it's all coming clear why, I think my siblings and I were pretty sheltered. Our parents were middle class. They both graduated from college. Their parents only graduated from high school, but put all their kids through college, made sure they went to college. And so like you say, there's white privilege. I think also for some of us as African Americans, there's a privilege too, because we were sheltered. I did not come in contact with a lot of racism. I knew Black doctors, I knew Black lawyers. I did not, and my parents were involved. They were members of NAACP and those types of things with the voter. And we always went with my parents to vote. There were certain things that they stressed, and that was education, and that was voting, and that was realizing that you were just as good as anybody else. My mother's statement was, everybody goes to the bathroom the same way. I still tell my kids that now, so it's not the prettiest thing to say, but it just gives a perspective on you're not better than someone else and they're not better than you. So I think it was so it different where you grew up really makes a difference.
Yeah.
Can people change? I say, yeah, people can change. I'm a social worker. I believe people can make a change, but I think you have to want to make a change. You have to work hard to make a change. It doesn't come easy because you have this life history, that goes with you.
I had a friend who said, you might feel it in your heart and you might feel it in your mind, but until you act,
it's not an easy thing.
You have to manifest it.
It's
So
not an easy thing.
You might see something that makes you sad and you think a little about it and that's it, or you think about something, but it doesn't make you sad and you just, and I think that might be an example of what we have here when we think about, did people change? Did Strom Thurmond change? He got the black vote.
He had a Black daughter. He played around with the Black girls.
And that was not a secret in South Carolina, but because Ms. Washington refused to talk to reporters, it was known, it was not a secret whatsoever in the Black community. And when it became known in the white community gradually, that there was no way to really document it until she decided to speak about it.
It was a secret to me, I guess, because I didn't live here. So I didn't know about it. But when I found out about it, I was angry because she didn't. But as I learned more about the history, I understand why she probably wouldn't say anything too. So for fear, her daughter and for herself. So her well-being.
Her mother was 16. So if you think about sexual assault laws, that tells you something about not just Strom Thurmond, but white men. And you may remember I read you that part of that letter from Reverend Hinton, where he says, the reason we are brown and golden, and those are my words, is
that's true. Yeah, I see it in my own family. And when Myra said about Yankee, when she said, I'm a Yankee, I never got called a Yankee until I came to South Carolina. I never heard it. I didn't think about the Civil War like that. I didn't think about the Civil War. And I just never had heard that. I never heard anybody say, oh yeah, you're a Yankee. I never heard that,
Well, think about a state that still claims that the Confederate War was, or not a state. White people in a state who still claim that Civil War was not fought about slavery. Despite the statements of all the officials who were creating that situation. There's a powerful sense of denial to our history and the way it's written. And we right now have legislation being proposed in South Carolina that would provide from conservative organizations, a patriotic history of the U.S. And I think we all know what that probably means. One of the
Oops, frozen.
Who's
frozen?
Stand by.
Somebody's frozen.
who gets to tell it? We have a group document where you've done your 3 fun facts. And I hope that if you didn't do them, you'll add to that, or now you'll look at them so we know each other better. And we'll be talking more in the next 2 sessions. And let's see, before we go, you do have homework, which is reading. And if you didn't look at Houston's film of the horrible schools in South Carolina, do that. It's eye-opening. So we're going to be talking about the power structure, about the doll test and the court case and the aftermath. So The testimony in court is really very interesting, and I do include some of the key points about the schools and information about the doll test. I interviewed one of the people that did look at the dolls, and so we'll talk about that, and also hear more from you. So I'm waiting for your great thoughts, and thank you very much for coming, and I hope very much to see you next week. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thanks, Claudia.
Yeah,
Thank you,
my pleasure,
Claudia.
truly.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Feel free to, I think most of you've contributed to the 3 facts about yourself. Hopefully we'll add that in. It's not too late. It's a working document, and I'll send the recording around if you'd like to watch it again, or for those who missed the in real life version. We'll
Yeah,
see you
if
in the
people
next.
who are watching the recording want to submit questions, I don't have any problem with that. No.
Okay, well, I'll include your contact info and the emails, and we'll piece it together.
Okay.
Thanks everybody
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Bye, guys.
Thank
See you
you.
next Tuesday.
Thank you.
All right.
Wednesday.
Oh, sorry,
Wednesday.
next Wednesday. Next Wednesday. See you next Wednesday.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.